Hello and welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. I'm David Wheatley and we're here to talk all things leadership. And this week, in the words of the great Leeds philosophers Chumbawamba, we're going to be dealing with I get knocked down, but I get up again. Resilience. And my guest is looking at me as if to say, I really came on this, and you're going to say things like that. Judy Brown, welcome back. I appreciate you sharing a while back. And we've been talking about the idea of resilience, especially these times, challenging times that people are going through. And you had a few thoughts that we could discuss today. So welcome again.
Thank you. I actually think the introduction of I get knocked down, I bounce back up again is utterly perfect, because I think all of us get knocked down at times, and the question of how easily we come back and what methods we use to do that are subjects that are worth exploring together. I think one of the things, people have a tendency to think some people are resilient and other people aren't. And it may be true that some of us have more of an inborn ability to bounce back. But I think the important knowledge these days and research says that any of us can strengthen our resilience by practices we undertake, by specific things we do. And particularly since we're in this COVID season that looks as if it's going to last, we don't know how long and how it's going to go. I think it's a particular time to pay attention to the practices that can make us steadier in the midst of all this unsteadiness around us.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, that idea of is it built in or is it trainable? And I was having a conversation recently actually with one of my previous guests, Bronson and Clow, about the military, and there's so many books out these days by SEALs and people like that who about leadership. And one of my challenges on it is they get to lead people who are phenomenally resilient because of the selection process for any of these special forces groups. They have to be, it weeds out the people who aren't resilient. And so some of my wife's research work suggests that there's a lot less PTSD in the special forces because they select in the people who are particularly resilient. But for the rest of us, as menials, it is something that we can build and develop. And I'm looking forward to having that conversation with you today.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways we can build it. I mean, one of the things I'd like to point to begin with is some work that Peter Vail did on what he calls permanent whitewater. And it's particularly helpful because I think the kind of change we're dealing with right now is going on a lot longer than we had anticipated. So there are certain kind of resilience practices that help us to get back steadied up on our feet when something that's a surprise wave hits us.
Right.
But he points us in a direction of practices that are particularly helpful when it turns out that we're kayaking or canoeing in permanent whitewater. We go around the corner and there's more of it, and we're getting tired from it. So let me talk a little bit about that. Vail says that our tendency when we're faced with challenge is to try to work harder and to work smarter, to be more organized, or to have better technology. He calls that working technologically smarter. But he says in this kind of permanent whitewater, there are three practices beyond those initial three that really have a payoff. One is to work reflectively smarter, which means to build in time and practices for taking stock of ourselves and what's going on around us. For me, my standard one for that has been for about 40 years is journal. I get up every morning and spend a half an hour in my journal, and every day goes better because I do that. If I fall off the wagon for a day, the day doesn't go so well. So reflect.
If I just step into that, your permanent whitewater example, I think even in permanent whitewater, there's the occasional eddy. And what you're talking about is find the occasional eddy and just take a moment to breathe and stop. And whether it be journaling or take a walk in the woods, wherever it may be, just staring out the window, just take that moment, because we know that we can't stay there. And we know
Yeah.
once we get back into the turmoil, it's going to be turmoil.
David, that is terrific. That's what happens when two people who kayak have this kind of conversation. So there are eddies, and whatever your practice, whether it's meditation or journal or running or being in nature, that's the eddy. Grab it while you can. But I
And
would
not just grab it, but schedule it.
schedule it in. That's what I
Yeah.
was going to say. Schedule it in. And then he says the second practice that's important is to work collectively smarter, which means we may feel like we're kind of hunkered down, because most of us are. And we forget that there are still people all around us and available to us who may have guidance for us, who may have ideas, who can chat with us about various things. And that helps us be smarter in these times. And then the third thing he talks about is being spiritually smarter. And he doesn't necessarily mean by that anything religious, although he wouldn't rule that out. For some people, it is a faith practice. But for many people, working spiritually smarter means being much more in touch with what matters most to them, being in touch with their values. For me, frankly, I think nature is probably my favorite spiritual source. It's whenever I can, getting myself in a natural setting, even though I'm fairly locked down with COVID. So working reflectively smarter, collectively smarter, and spiritually smarter are the ones that will keep us settled and functioning well in permanent whitewater.
And I again go back, and maybe it's my history of teaching whitewater kayaking, but I'm connected to this in a big way. But the fact that the eddies are the reflective, they're working collectively. You know, the idea of let's take it in turns to shoot this next one, because shooting it first is going to take a lot more effort and energy and thought, and then the rest of us can take advantage of what the first person did, and then let's make sure we're swapping that around. And the spiritually smarter, as you're talking about nature, the thing for me would be just bear in mind where I am and how beautiful it all is and how wonderful this opportunity is. I actually had a chance to talk to another friend of mine, Scott McFarland, a few episodes ago, but we really got into the spirit and how to balance spirit in your life as well. So I guess the other thing that comes from whitewater is they say that you should never be letting the current set the pace. As a whitewater kayaker, you should either be going slightly faster or slightly slower than the current, so that you're somewhat in control.
Somewhat in control.
Yeah.
You know, this is reminding me, David, that anytime I'm teaching this as a management philosophy, you have to come along. I'm not used to having somebody who's really an expert on this. This is a treat. This is a treat. We'll see. I'm going to shift to something else. I suspect you're an expert on this one too. So let me, all right.
No, I don't claim to be an expert on anything, and I definitely am out of date with my expertise in whitewater kayaking. So
kayaks and whitewater haven't changed, David. You don't get out of step with that. The next educator for me, guide for me, is the work of Ernest Shackleton, who in 1915, took a group of 27 sailors and scientists on an expedition to Antarctica with the plan that they were going to walk across Antarctica. But to get there, they had to sail through some pretty rough going. And they had the kind of bad luck that would leave you thinking your day at the office or your day in the house wasn't so bad after all. The ship gets caught in the ice, and they figure they're going to wait until spring when the ice lets up, and the ice doesn't let up, it crushes the ship and it goes down. And Shackleton does two things that are really brilliant. The first thing he says is, you have to leave all your valuables on the ship and take only what's essential. And he's pointing people toward, in this dynamic they're in, which is not what they expected, what are they holding on to from their old life that is of no earthly use? And what do they need to take with them in order to now do what they have to do, which, as he says, is ship's gone down, now we go back to England.
Right.
That was his language. So
it resets what you see as valuable, doesn't it? I'm thinking about that as we were just walking out in our garden, which has got a lot more food in it than it did a year ago. And
Yeah,
and it's kind of resetting that if we potentially can't go out, you can't go out to the shops and everything else, then what's valuable is let's dig up the lawn and turn it into
right,
something we can eat.
right, which the environmentalists have been trying to get us to do forever because the grass is not exactly great for the environment. You're right. That's a good example of the reset. Good example of the reset. So there's another thing that I found helpful in dealing with the kind of uncertainty, which is a particular question that a friend asked me about a month ago. And he said he thought I seemed kind of calm in this circumstance. And he wanted to know if I'd ever been through anything like this before. It's
Mhm.
that question. Have you ever been through anything like this before?
Mhm.
That is the useful one right now, because if you can hearken back to whatever that was and think about what process or practices or approach you used that got you through, it's like your individual fingerprint for how to deal with these kinds of things. You have much greater strengths than you're going to recall when you're having a moment where you just think, I can't stand any more of this.
Right. It's not just
So
about have you been through COVID before? Because we obviously haven't. It's about when was the time when you were put under pressure, that the world around you was changing, and think
yeah,
about what you did at that point, which, it could be when you left school or college to go out into the the real world or wherever it may be, or get that first job.
that's
Um,
exactly right. I mean, when he asked me that question, what came to mind was when, as a Pan American flight attendant, I was on a flight that lost an engine, and we had to go back to England, and we were too heavy to land. So we had to dump all the fuel and go in circles until we were light enough to land. That felt like this. So
right.
the question is, it's a feeling sense of
Mhm.
it. And if you can get back to that and see what you did, therein is a good strategy to
Right.
return. Yeah, to return to.
And I think
Um,
that the key there is that you identify is the to notice. So to notice the feeling and then recognize what the feeling is, and then connect it back to that other feeling and think about what worked, what didn't work in this other place. But that, unless I'm paying attention to how I'm feeling right now,
yes.
that sense of I'm getting some kind of butterflies in my stomach, wherever that may be.
Right. When did I also get these?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then play back what I did at that point.
David, you're really good at putting together a step-by-step approach to this sort of thing. I do these intuitive leaps. Remember a time and then figure out how you did it and do it again. Thank you. It's really helpful.
It's
I
funny. We have a tool we call Notice, Stop, Think, and Choose.
got
That
it.
is actually in our latest book, which he happens to have here handy. That, of course,
Good
listeners
work.
will. But in What Great Teams Do Great, it used to be Stop, Think, and Choose, which was simply create a space to stop, so that you can think rationally, logically, and then you can make a better choice. But the addition of notice up front, which is really notice the feeling, the triggers,
Yes,
the what's going on physically, which then leads to and when you get that stop, create the space, create the eddy in order
right.
to take that moment to think and then make a better choice.
So it's a pause. It's realizing that when we have these feelings, that a pause is in order. I want to add also to this notion of resilience the work of Lucy Hone, who is a researcher from Australia. Has done a fabulous TED Talk on resilience. Her research is on optimism, actually. But what she learned from her research, particularly when she herself experienced a huge, huge loss, is that it's possible to both grieve and live simultaneously. And I think for many of us, there are huge losses in this season. Some are losses that would have been in this season anyway. Some are losses because of COVID. That is,
Mhm.
people in our family are lost, and or friends. And the other is things that we'll never get back, like the high school education of our child or the graduation that's
Mhm.
not coming back. Those are losses as well. And she gives us 3 rules to operate by when to stay resilient in the face of real loss. The first rule is acknowledge that hard things are hard. They just are. And I think that's to your noticing, David. That's just being aware that that's true. Don't fool yourself with silver linings. This is tough, whatever this is.
And that kind of links into some of the, we've been talking up here about the Black Lives Matter, the race challenges that are going on at the moment. And I've been telling people, messy conversations are going to be messy. And you have to appreciate that they're going to be messy, which is the same thing you're saying, is acknowledge that hard conversations, hard things are going to be hard.
Yes, they are. And it doesn't mean you're in the wrong place. It means you're in the right place.
Yeah.
The second thing that Hone says is that even when that's true, and particularly when that's true, you should hunt the good. And she uses that language when she is training military people to be resilient. So we often say, well, look for the upside or whatever. But the language she uses, which is hunt the good, is much stronger and I think helpful in this case. And then she has a third rule, which is ask yourself repeatedly, is what I am doing right now helping me or harming me? And it's the me at the end of that that's critical, because most of us who are trying to do our best in the world are trying to make sure we are helping and not harming other people. But this has at the end of the sentence, me. All right, me. And so behind that is the notion of the flight attendant with the oxygen masks, and that is put your own mask on first before trying to help others. We're no good if we aren't steady and resilient ourselves.
Right.
So,
which is interesting because that peels back to the white water, doesn't it? That I've got to make the space and the place for me to stop and re-energize. Even if it's permanent white water, I've got to look for those opportunities.
Yes. And as you said, and make them. And then there's another resource I'd point us to, and this one, just because it's such fun, there is a TED Talk by a fellow by the name of Sean Achor. Last name is like Anchor with no N, Achor. And it's on happiness and work or something like that. But what he says is that we have a tendency to always think we'll be happy if something happens. When COVID disappears, I'll be happy. When I get a Jaguar convertible, I'll be happy. Who knows what we're telling ourselves, but at some point we'll be happy if. And what he says is that if we are happy, we will do better. So happiness is a goal as a first step because the results will be better. And he says there are 5 practices that will help us reset in the direction of happiness. I would say in the direction of optimism is another way of thinking about it, so that we can think clearly about what's possible ahead. And those 5 practices are this. The first is to begin the day with 3 specific gratitudes, things you're grateful for. If your dog was on yesterday's list, he cannot be on again today. It has to be 3 new gratitudes. The second is meditation, a practice so you begin to understand the way your mind works and be able to follow it. The third is journal, because journaling trains you to take your life seriously and to pay attention to it. And David, as you said, to simply notice what's going on so you begin to see the patterns in your life and learn from them. The fourth thing is, before you open your emails every day, send 3 appreciative notes to people, he says, in your network. I would say friends, colleagues, whatever, of just what you cherish about them and what a difference they make to you. And then the last one, which is the one I can't practice because I'm sitting in a chair, well, I suppose I could, is exercise, because exercise tells your mind that what you do matters. So those are his 5. But behind that is this notion that whether you see yourself as a realist, which is what we call a pessimist, or an optimist, which is what a realist calls somebody with their head in the clouds, whichever place you are on that, you can reset with these kinds of practices in the direction of optimism. Now the question is, the realist will say, why would I want to do that? It would not be who I am. The reason you would want to do that is because the research says that optimists don't necessarily have the details of the here and now as precisely right as the realist pessimists do, but they are much more successful. They get much better results, and they're happier.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's research that manages to insult all of us.
So, well, it's kind of like, don't seek happiness, be happy.
Yeah, yeah. And be happy in the sense of have practices that allow you to be happy.
Yeah.
You may not be happy naturally, and it may be a rough day.
Well, I think you're right that there's some people that just intuitively lean to that. Okay, we're here. This is a situation. Let me
Right.
get the most out of it. And there's other people who get pulled down by that situation, and it's retraining ourselves to not allow that to take over. And I think
Yes.
we're going to be talking in a few episodes more about the idea of meditation and some simple practices for those that have never done it and want to get started on it. Because I think that's one of the obstacles sometimes is you say this journaling and meditation, and these feel hard to your average person because shutting down your mind and actually writing is challenging. But we're going to be looking at that in a few episodes. So
That's
it's a
great.
nice build on. So I really appreciate you. I mean, that's some real practical wisdom, whether it be Whitewater, whether it be Shackleton, or whether it be, I think, what was the Harvard Happiness Project? Was that the Sean Anker one?
I don't know. I've heard of that. I've heard of that project, but
I know I read his book, but I may have read the other one as well.
well, the other one that I point people to is Martin Seligman's book, his work on learned optimism, which is at the heart of the research on the much higher effectiveness of people who, whether by their nature or their practice or both, are able to maintain a steady, optimistic orientation, even in all this,
Right.
this. So.
Cool. Well, I hope there's at least one nugget that people can pull out of this for themselves that will help them deal with whatever's going on in their world, whether it be COVID or just anything else. And there's a lot of job changes and such, which is making increasing pressure and making life a little bit more challenging. So if there's one nugget in this 20 minutes that you can pull, then that would be great. Judy, thank you very much again for being one of our irregular guests. But we look forward to having you on again. This is the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. I'm David Wheatley. Thanks to Brian, Spencer, and Finkel for our intro music. Please share any feedback, suggestions, like and subscribe. If you want to give us a review on iTunes, that will be wonderful, because then we might get noticed. I can be contacted at humanergy.com. And until next time, stay healthy. Thank you very much.